Egypt has been around for a while, and when you're working with multiple thousands of years of history, time can get pretty fuzzy. The pyramids were older to Cleopatra than she is to us, and long before Herodotus or Thucydides did us all the favor of committing the events of Greek history to writing, the Egyptians were well aware of the interplay between past, present, and future. To that end, there's one particularly noteworthy example of how the notions of history can end up influencing how the history itself gets written, or in this case, overwritten, and it's the story of Hatshepsut. Not only was she one of Egypt's most successful rulers in the New Kingdom, with a considerable long-term impact on Egypt's well-being, but she was also arguably Egypt's first female pharaoh. And perhaps most intriguingly, a couple decades after her death, her name was erased from her monuments and her statues were quite literally defaced. In many ways, it's a miracle that we even know about her at all, but her rule was a truly exceptional one. She became pharaoh through unconventional means, completed extraordinary feats for the cultural and economic benefit of Egypt, and after her death, her name and entire existence was almost erased from memory. Every part of her life was either an oddity, an exception, or a complete mystery. Yet her name and fantastic story were almost lost to time. While some have ascribed this grand erasure to familial rage, Hatshepsut's post-mortem demise was almost entirely due to perceptions of history, an attempt to clean up the historical narrative to suit the wishes of her successors. So, with my grand thematic preamble all laid out, let's do some history. Hatshepsut was born in the late 1500s BC to the pharaoh Thutmose I, whose accomplishments included military campaigns into Syria and Nubia, which you may note are in different directions, so props to him. Hatshepsut, who was a full royal, married her half-brother Thutmose II, who was from a different wife who wasn't quite as royal. It's important to know that Egyptian royalty typically intermarried so as to keep the family line pure, but also the king practiced mild polygamy and bore children from multiple royal wives so as not to keep the family too pure. Check out this video on the dumpster fire of a family tree that is the Ptolemaic dynasty for a case study in why practicing inbreeding for 300 years is a terrible idea. Anyway, Hatshepsut served as Thutmose II's queen for the decade and change that he ruled for. He honestly didn't do a whole lot, possibly in part because he was notoriously sickly, but whatever the case, even when Hatshepsut was still simply a queen, she wielded what was likely quite a bit of power over Egypt. When Thutmose II died, the throne passed on to his son and Hatshepsut's stepson Thutmose III. The problem was that Thutmose III was a very tiny child, so he was still in Egyptian preschool learning his AB squiggles. As such, most of the actual power went back to Hatshepsut, who served officially as his regent. Now, this had happened at several points in the past, as Egyptian queens serving as regents was perfectly fine in the eyes of everyone involved, but at some point, somewhere, somehow, we don't really know, the balance of power shifted. Hatshepsut officially declared herself to be co-pharaoh of Egypt along with her young stepson. And this was interesting because it wasn't strictly illegal in any sense, and she wasn't usurping power from her still probably chewing on his arm for entertainment stepson. It's just that no one had really done it before. But in Egyptian culture, the pharaoh is the incarnation of the male god Horus. So while being the regent for her stepson was completely innocuous, being a pharaoh was new for people. And this is actually really cool because of how it relates to her projection of her gender. She dressed in the typical male attire of a pharaoh and even wore a fake beard, but in all surviving writings she's referred to with grammatically female language and titles. So she wasn't trying to hide anything from anyone, but she was conscious of the cultural and ceremonial importance of a pharaoh's appearance. And it's actually pretty funny. The archaeologist and Egyptologist Jean-François Champollion, like the guy who discovered how to translate hieroglyphs after Napoleon dug up the Rosetta Stone, was notoriously super confused on account of this one specific monarch that repeatedly showed up in art and records with female titles and attributes, despite the masculine dress and very man-like beard. People argued over this for a century and a half until we all finally figured out that her bearded Hatshepsut was indeed a queen. So now that she's on the throne, let's take a look at exactly what Hatshepsut did with her 2 decades in power. Besides presumably annoying her temporally substandard co-pharaoh to no end by the sheer virtue of her being there, Hatshepsut's most notable accomplishments come through to us in her extensive building program. She built and restored temples all across Egypt, from the furthest reaches of the Nile all the way up into the Levant. In the city of Thebes, the temple complex of Karnak had somewhat fallen into disrepair, and Hatshepsut fixed a lot of it up. Not only did she carve relief sculptures into or paint on most of the walls, she had a particular fondness for erecting obelisks. obelisks, and as it happens, the tallest surviving ancient obelisk that we know of is from Hatshepsut's reign. And it's just kind of cool for me to think that even they had that same preservative instincts towards the past. Even 3,500 years ago, there was still at least 1,000 more years of history that people saw as worth saving. Perhaps her most notable accomplishment as far as buildings go is her mortuary temple of Djeser-Djeseru, meaning holiest of holies. We've unfortunately lost parts of it over the millennia, but even back in the day, people knew that it was a big deal. It's a triple-terraced, colonnaded temple complex that almost looks like it's coming out of the mountain behind it. The terraces were connected by a series of long ramps surrounded by foreign plants and trees. It's an amazing feat of architecture that's not only beautiful, but quite unique in its style as well. Hatshepsut's steward and architect Senenmut, who has been speculated to be her lover, but it doesn't really matter because we have no real way of knowing, did a spectacular job on this one. And you can't just go around building and restoring temples left and right all willy-nilly without having the economic resources to pay for it, so it's a good thing that Hatshepsut pursued an extensive campaign of trade with regions outside of Egypt. As documented in beautiful reliefs from her mortuary temple, she conducted a trading mission to the land of Punt, which resulted in Egypt bringing back a comical amount of valuable foods, gold, ivory, trees, plants, and other cool stuff from the region. While that's her most famous achievement, she also established trade ties with the lands in and around the Levant, which proved to be quite lucrative for Egypt in times to follow. As far as we know, her reign was largely internally and externally peaceful. Like many people who existed before the discovery of penicillin in 1928, Hatshepsut died of probably an infection around when she was 50. A handful of years and maybe even a couple decades after her death, her name and statues were widely wiped out in an attempt to erase the fact that she ever existed, which is pretty harsh. It is no fun having your own name taken off the mortuary temple that you built for yourself. The prevailing theory is that her stepson Thutmose III did it, but not because he had some built-up resentment towards her and destroyed her images in a fit of rage. There are a few reasons why that doesn't really work. What's more likely is that Thutmose erased his stepmother's name in an attempt to clean up the narrative. We know this because in some places where her name gets crossed out, it's written over with the name of Thutmose's son, Amenhotep II. Since Hatshepsut came to power in an unconventional way, Thutmose would have had good reason to try and sideline that part of the narrative to more strongly establish the legitimacy of his patrilineal royalty. And like I said with the curious case of the confused Champollion, it worked for a good long time. I'm pretty sure the only reason we still have Djeser-Djeseru is because rather than destroy it, other pharaohs just kept taking credit for it themselves in an eternal cycle of plagiaristic self-aggrandizement. After centuries of mystery surrounding Hatshepsut, archaeologist Zahi Hawass discovered what he, and also I, believe to be the body of Hatshepsut in the KV60 tomb in the Valley of the Kings. They identified her by matching a tooth found in a canopic box bearing Hatshepsut's name to the mouth of the mummy itself. It's not DNA evidence, so some people still have doubts, but when you find the mummy of a royal in a tomb in the Valley of the Kings right next to a box that's essentially marked the royal guts of Hatshepsut, which contains a tooth that matches exactly, what can I say? Color me convinced. So that's Hatshepsut, a queen who became a pharaoh through unusual means and went on to accomplish extraordinary things before suffering one of the most brutal historical erasures ever and subsequently turning into one of Egypt's most fascinating mysteries. As Egyptian history is a long and winding road, there may well be many other interesting characters like this that we just don't know about. So the joke's honestly on us, because to future archaeologists, we'll look just as silly as poor old Champollion does to us, tearing his hair out over the bearded pharaoh with a woman's name.